The sky over the Atlantic carried the gray hue of a war that felt endless. Salt spray hit the portholes of the converted Liberty ship as it crept toward Norfolk Harbor. Laszlo Kovacs pressed his forehead to the cold, fogged glass and stared out. What he saw was nothing like the America he'd been told about. No weakness, no farmland of scared shopkeepers. Only steel. In silence that hummed with power. The Liberty ship rolled through choppy water, its engines grinding a tired rhythm. Behind Laszlo, the hold groaned with the weight of nearly 800 Hungarian prisoners of war. Once they'd marched proudly under the banners of a struggling ally. Now they were stacked like freight, uniforms tattered, boots worn thin, faces lined with weeks of defeat. They had surrendered in Italy, their guns lowered not out of cowardice but exhaustion. None of them had expected to cross the ocean, none had expected this. Laszlo's breath fogged the glass again. At first only shapes emerged, thin lines against the gray. Then they grew, sharper with every passing minute. What he'd thought were buildings were warships. Rows upon rows of them, lined up like silent titans in the mist. Destroyers, cruisers, and carriers stretched farther than the eye could measure. Even at this distance, they radiated purpose, like hammers waiting to strike. He swallowed hard, the taste of iron and seawater in his mouth. Every word of German propaganda he'd been fed seemed to crumble in that moment. He'd heard that America was slow to mobilize, dependent on outdated tools and untrained boys. But the view through the porthole was not a nation fumbling in the dark. It was a machine already in motion. Behind him, a murmur rippled through the prisoners. Even the officers, stiff-backed in their patched uniforms, leaned forward for a glimpse. Someone whispered, "There must be hundreds of them." The voice cracked with disbelief. The harbor grew clearer, and with it, the world Laszlo thought he knew began to fracture. Massive cranes swung with perfect timing, hauling steel as if it weighed nothing. Dry docks opened their jaws to half-built ships, their ribcage exposed, waiting to become instruments of war. Workers moved like a coordinated tide, fast, steady, efficient. It was not chaos, it was choreography. Laszlo had grown up in Budapest, fixing engines in a cramped garage that smelled of oil and rainwater. His hands had known the weight of rust and scarcity. Even at its best, Hungary's industry had been modest, fragile. This was something else entirely. He felt like a man staring into the engine room of the world. A siren sounded on the docks, not frantic, measured. Within seconds, the cranes adjusted, trucks rolled forward, ships shifted position. Every movement had a place, every person had a role. This was not a country stumbling toward victory. This was a country already living inside it. The Liberty ship slowed, guided by tugboats as it slid into its berth. The prisoners crowded the railing, their boots scraping against the deck. The smell of the harbor filled the air, diesel, salt, hot steel. Laszlo had smelled burning tanks, rotting trenches, the rot of war. This smelled like victory. The gangway lowered with a heavy clang, and for the first time in weeks, the Hungarian prisoners touched solid ground. They had expected to see barbed wire and armed soldiers barking orders. Instead, they saw rows of uniformed Americans who stood straight, calm, methodical. They carried rifles, yes, but without menace. There was no shouting, no chaos, only precision. As the line of prisoners shuffled forward, Laszlo glanced up at the nearest carrier. Its gray hull rose into the sky like a fortress at sea. He thought of the trenches on the Eastern Front, of the patched boots, the thin soup, the rusting guns. He thought of what it must have taken to build this ship, to man it, to send it across the world. A single aircraft carrier represented more power than Hungary could muster in a year. And here there were dozens. A young American sergeant handed out identification tags and gestured them into trucks. His voice was even, practiced, efficient. The men moved as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Paperwork clipped onto boards, trucks lined up without gaps, drivers already waiting. Every detail of the process was smooth, silent, terrifying in its quiet strength. Peter Sabo, a sergeant from Laszlo's old unit, whispered as they climbed into the back of a truck. "They don't even look tired," he said. Laszlo followed his gaze. Dock workers were hauling crates, welding steel, operating cranes. None of them bore the hollow, desperate look of men clinging to a dying war effort. These were people who knew they would win. The trucks pulled away from the docks. Through the slats of the wooden bed, Laszlo caught his final glimpse of the harbor. The warships didn't seem like ships at all anymore. They looked like a statement. An empire not built on conquered land, but on industrial certainty. The road from the harbor was smooth, wide, alive with motion. Military convoys moved in both directions, sharing the lanes with civilian cars. Civilian cars. Laszlo couldn't remember the last time he'd seen an ordinary person behind the wheel. In Europe, fuel had long become a ghost. Here it seemed endless. Peter leaned closer. "They're living like the war isn't even here," he muttered. And he was right. Everything outside that truck seemed untouched by the fire consuming the world. Billboards lined the roadside, bright colors, bold letters, advertising things that had vanished from Europe years ago. Coffee, butter, new tires. Even the trucks themselves gleamed with care, engines that started on the first try, tires without patches, machines that worked. The truck jolted as it hit a turn, and Laszlo gripped the sideboard. He had crossed battlefields filled with wreckage, watched cities burn to blackened husks, marched through mud and ash. But nothing had shaken him quite like this drive. This wasn't just strength. It was abundance. And abundance was a power far greater than any bomb or rifle. As the convoy sped inland, the sound of the harbor faded. But its image remained, steel giants sleeping in the mist, waiting for orders. Laszlo leaned his head back against the truck's wooden wall. For the first time since the war began, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear of death, but the cold realization that they had been fighting against something far larger than they ever understood. The truck disappeared into the Virginia countryside, but the harbor stayed behind in his mind, a promise or a warning. The truck rumbled inland, its tires humming over flawless asphalt. Laszlo stared out through the slats, but his mind was already far from Virginia. The endless lines of warships at the harbor had cracked something open inside him. The images stirred old memories, the ones he'd spent years pushing down beneath layers of duty and mud. Memories of how he'd ended up wearing a uniform he'd never wanted. Hungary's path into this war hadn't been born from hunger for conquest. It had begun with fear, cold, calculated fear. The country had been a small piece on a board where the real players were monsters. To the west, Germany, a roaring empire in steel boots. To the east, the Red Army, vast, brutal, unstoppable. Between them, Hungary had no illusions about its place. They hadn't chosen a side, they had chosen to survive. Laszlo remembered the day the war came for him. It wasn't with banners or speeches. It was a letter delivered to his small workshop in Budapest. The paper smelled faintly of ink and rain. The words were simple, report for service. He'd stared at that letter for hours, fingers black with oil, his wrench still lying where he'd dropped it. The engines he used to fix didn't ask questions. They either worked or they didn't. The war, though, it asked everything. Hungary had signed its fate years before. When German troops rolled across borders, the government bent rather than broke. Neutrality wasn't an option. The alternative was to stand alone before Stalin's armies. And no one in Budapest believed they could survive that. Recruitment was swift. Conscription came cloaked in talk of defense and honor, but everyone knew it was a German leash. Laszlo had boarded the troop train 2 weeks later with a single bag and a silent heart. He left behind the only life he understood, grease-stained hands, a small rented room, the quiet hum of engines. The front was nothing like the speeches. The first months were in Yugoslavia, walking roads that had already been conquered. The fighting was light there, more occupation than war. But it was in the east, in the frozen fields of the Soviet front, that everything changed. He still remembered the snow. How it swallowed sound, how it hid the dead until the thaw. German officers barked orders in clipped tones, their confidence as sharp as their boots. But the Russians did not fight the way the Germans had promised. They did not break. They absorbed. One winter morning, his unit advanced toward a village that no longer existed, just black timbers and frozen soil. The Soviets counterattacked with a force that seemed endless. Laszlo fired until the rifle jammed, until his hands burned through gloves that were too thin. His friend Istvan fell face first into the snow, no last words, just silence. In those months, the idea of Germany as a mighty ally began to rot. What they had entered was not a partnership, it was servitude. The Wehrmacht got the warm coats, the Hungarians got what was left. They dug trenches, they died in them. When he returned to Budapest on brief leave in 1943, the city no longer felt like home. The cafes were half empty, posters covered cracked walls. People spoke in whispers about rationing, about bombing raids inching closer to the heart of Europe. Germany's promises of shared victory had begun to sound like prayers muttered by men who knew the end was coming. Then came Italy's. By the time his unit was transferred south, everything had changed. The Axis line was bending, breaking. American bombers owned the skies. And the Hungarians, already stretched thin, were caught in the collapse. Laszlo remembered the night before their surrender. Rain had soaked the fields near Cassino. They dug shallow foxholes, their rifles slick with mud. Artillery rumbled in the distance, a storm that had no end. Peter had sat beside him, whispering about his old job at a factory in Paix, about bread, about home. It had felt like talking to someone already gone. When the Americans came, they came like a tide. Artillery, planes, precision. The battle didn't last long, 3 days. On the third morning, their officers dropped their pistols in the mud and raised a white cloth. There was no grand speech, no resistance, just the quiet sound of men who had nothing left to give. And then something unexpected, mercy. The Americans treated the wounded. They shared rations. They called them prisoners, not vermin. That small difference, so unthinkable in a world ruled by German cruelty, stuck in Laszlo's mind like a nail in wood. Now, as the truck sped through the Virginia countryside, those memories sat heavy in his chest. Hungary had entered the war out of fear. He had followed orders out of duty. But standing on that ship deck hours earlier, watching the American harbor unfold, he had seen something terrifying. They had chosen to fight the wrong enemy. He wasn't alone in this thought. The faces around him carried the same quiet reckoning. Their war was already lost. The only thing left was to understand why. Peter tapped the wooden sideboard of the truck. "Do you ever think," he murmured, "what if we'd had something like this?" He didn't mean the road or the trucks. He meant the harbor, the organization, the strength that radiated from it. Laszlo didn't answer. He didn't need to. That question wasn't about Hungary winning the war. It was about Hungary ever being capable of something like it. The truck rolled on, trees blurring into a green smear as the convoy pushed toward the camp. Inside, the past echoed with every turn of the wheels. The letter, the snow, the surrender. All of it had led here, to a country that hadn't chosen survival through fear, but through power. And for the first time, Laszlo understood just how different those two choices truly were. The trucks groaned as they climbed out of the harbor district and onto the open roads of Virginia. Laszlo sat wedged between Peter and another soldier, their wrists still bound with loose rope, the wood of the truck bed creaking beneath them. The smell of salt faded into something new, dry grass, warm air, and a kind of stillness he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in months, there was no distant rumble of artillery. The road stretched straight and smooth beneath the convoy. It wasn't scarred with shell craters or clogged with wreckage. No abandoned carts, no burned-out vehicles, no desperate civilians. Instead, the landscape rolled on green fields, tidy farmhouses, fences still standing. It looked untouched, as though the war was happening on another planet entirely. Ahead, cars and military trucks passed in opposite directions, their drivers nodding casually at the convoy, as if this was just another Tuesday. Civilian cars, clean, well-kept, full of families, not soldiers. In Europe, fuel was life. Here, it seemed like air, everywhere, invisible, taken for granted. Laszlo leaned forward slightly, hands braced against the sideboard. Even the asphalt looked too perfect. In Hungary, roads were cracked, half swallowed by mud. Here, the black surface shimmered like ink in the sun. Every mile carried another quiet message: this country doesn't fight on its knees. Peter pointed with his chin toward a billboard they passed on the left. Bright red letters screamed, "Drink fresh coffee, hot every morning." Below it, a painted woman in a neat apron smiled, as though the world wasn't burning. The image hit Laszlo harder than the sight of the warships had. It wasn't the coffee, it was the ease. The confidence of people who could still think about mornings. A few kilometers later, they passed a diner. Through the windows, Laszlo saw people sitting at tables, drinking, laughing. There was no fear in their eyes, no ration cards in their hands, no blackouts overhead. The difference wasn't just material, it was spiritual. The convoy finally slowed, as the forest gave way to fields stretching endlessly in every direction. In the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings stood in rigid rows, guarded by a low fence topped with barbed wire. A sign near the entrance read simply, "Camp Lay." The trucks pulled through the gate, and the men inside craned their necks to see. They had expected squalor, muddy compounds, barking guards, and the brutal efficiency they'd witnessed in German camps. But Camp Lay wasn't chaos, it was a small, clean city. Wooden barracks stood in long, straight lines. Gravel paths cut between them like precise seams. On one side, a large mess hall. On the other, a medical building, a recreation hut, and even what looked like a library. The American guards moved with practiced ease. Not once did anyone shout. As they climbed out of the trucks, each prisoner was processed one by one. Names checked against printed lists, tags assigned. Medical checks, showers, clean uniforms marked PW in black lettering. Every step was recorded. Nothing improvised. Nothing left to chance. Laszlo had experienced German organization, harsh, efficient, and fueled by fear. But this was something else entirely. The Americans didn't run on terror, they ran on systems that simply worked. As they were led to their barracks, Laszlo's boots sank softly into gravel that had been deliberately laid down to keep mud from forming. Each barracks had neat bunk beds, folded blankets, and small stoves already burning. The air inside smelled of pine and warm iron. It was almost comfortable. Peter gave a short, disbelieving laugh as they stepped inside. "This is a prison camp," he muttered. "It's cleaner than my old factory." The first shock came at dinner. The mess hall was a cavern of bright lights and noise, spoons clattering, voices buzzing in a dozen languages. The line moved fast, trays sliding on metal rails. When Laszlo reached the counter, a soldier with rolled-up sleeves handed him a full plate, thick slices of meat, vegetables, bread, and a steaming mug of real coffee. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trick. In Europe, they measured meat in grams and dreams. Here, prisoners were being served more in one meal than his unit had eaten in days. Peter held up his mug with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Do they feed their soldiers with gold? Laszlo didn't answer. He tasted the coffee slowly, letting the bitterness spread across his tongue. It was real, all of it was real. Around him, other prisoners whispered in disbelief. They had been told that Americans were desperate, soft, unprepared for war. But the guards moving through the room didn't look desperate. They looked rested, fed, confident. Across the mess hall, a young American corporal leaned against the wall, watching the prisoners eat. His uniform was clean, boots polished, rifle slung casually at his side. He wasn't here to terrify anyone. He didn't have to. Laszlo noticed something else, too. The guards weren't much older than he was. Many of them spoke quietly to each other in English, occasionally in other tongues, German, Italian, even Hungarian phrases picked up from somewhere. It was the first time he'd seen soldiers who seemed educated, articulate, and still dangerous. After the meal, the prisoners were led on a brief orientation. It was surreal, a camp with a library. Rows of books in multiple languages. Educational programs, notices on bulletin boards explaining how to request letters home. Letters, real letters. The Americans not only allowed it, they encouraged it. For men who had come from a continent of rationing, censorship, and fear, it was like stepping into a mirror world. Later that evening, lying on the bunk's thin mattress, Laszlo stared at the wooden ceiling. He could hear the distant whistle of a train somewhere beyond the fence and the soft creak of beds as exhausted men settled. He expected fear to gnaw at him, but instead there was something stranger. Disorientation. The war outside felt impossibly far away. Peter turned over on the bunk below him. "They don't fight the same war we do," he whispered. "They don't even live in the same world." Laszlo didn't respond, but the words clung to him. He thought about the muddy roads of Italy, the broken factories, the thin rations, the gnawing uncertainty that had followed every step of his service. Here, even captivity was organized, structured, almost humane. What did that say about the world they had fought for? A breeze slipped through the small open window, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant machinery. It was the kind of night smell he remembered from before the war, quiet, safe, whole. For the first time since his capture, he felt something stir inside him. Not hope exactly, but the fragile beginning of a question. What if everything they'd been told about this country was a lie? He exhaled slowly, staring at the ceiling as the lights outside dimmed. Tomorrow, the camp routine would begin. Work, inspections, education. But tonight the shock was still raw, the contrast too sharp to dull. If this was how America treated its prisoners, what did that mean for the men who fought beneath its flag? The night pressed in, quiet and unnervingly gentle. And somewhere in that quiet, the idea of what victory meant began to change. The morning air at Camp Ley carried the scent of pine and machine oil. For the prisoners, dawn came not with gunshots or sirens, but with the steady clang of a bell and the low rumble of engines. Laszlo climbed from his bunk, boots scraping on the wooden floor, and joined the line filing toward the yard. American soldiers, crisp and composed, handed out breakfast without shouting. Oatmeal, eggs, bread, coffee that still tasted like civilization. An hour later, the prisoners were split into work details. A group of 100 men, including Laszlo and Peter, were loaded into olive-drab trucks. No one told them where they were going. But as the convoy left the camp, Laszlo noticed something familiar on the horizon, smoke, not black and angry like the front, but clean and white, rising in perfect plumes. The road wound through farmland and small towns, everything intact and thriving. Factories stood next to houses, shops were open, trains roared past on tracks that hadn't been bombed to rubble. America wasn't hiding its war effort underground. It was building it in plain sight. Peter leaned closer. "It's strange," he murmured. "Where are their ruins?" Laszlo didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the growing shapes ahead, vast, gray hangar-like buildings swallowing the sky. The convoy slowed as it approached a fenced perimeter where guards checked identification papers, then waved them through. They'd arrived at a factory complex. Even from the truck bed, Laszlo could feel it, a pulse steady and deep like the heartbeat of a giant. Inside the gate, the world was in motion. Trucks, forklifts, carts, and men flowed in organized streams, never colliding, never hesitating. The hum of machinery rolled like distant thunder. The trucks stopped near a loading dock. A foreman in a blue cap, an older man with silver hair and calm eyes, greeted the guards. His voice wasn't that of a soldier. It was smooth, practiced, certain. This wasn't a military base. It was an engine of war. The prisoners were split into small groups, each led through a different part of the plant. Laszlo's group stepped through tall steel doors and entered the main hall. The first thing that hit him wasn't the sight. It was the sound. A wall of mechanical rhythm swallowed them. Hundreds of machines turned, stamped, spun, pressed. Steam hissed, sparks burst, belts whirred overhead like veins in a living thing. Rows upon rows of workers, men and women, moved with calm precision. Every motion had purpose, every sound belonged. He'd worked in workshops before the war. A dozen men around an engine, fighting rust and scarcity. But this was something else entirely. This was a symphony. The foreman raised his voice over the noise. Aircraft components, fuselage assembly. This line builds 24 planes a day. A few of the Hungarian prisoners exchanged quick looks. 24 planes in one day. For Hungary, 24 in a month would have been a miracle. Laszlo's gaze followed the line down the hall. Ribs of future aircraft moved on rails like iron skeletons. Every station added something new: panels, wiring, hydraulics. It was like watching a creature being born in slow, perfect rhythm. What struck him most was the people. The workers were not soldiers. They were civilians, young women in headscarves, men with calloused hands, some barely older than boys. And yet they moved with the discipline of an army. Above them, a massive clock ticked. On the wall hung posters with bold slogans: "Every rivet wins a battle." "Production is victory." Peter whispered, "They build planes like we bake bread." Laszlo nodded slowly, his throat dry. He thought of the workshops in Budapest, bare bulbs, old lathes, shortages of everything. Here shelves overflowed with parts, tools gleamed. No one shouted, no one begged for more steel or oil. They already had everything they needed. The prisoners were led further into the plant. The heat grew thicker as they passed massive furnaces where molten metal was poured into molds. Sparks rained like gold dust. Welders in heavy masks worked without pause, their movements almost elegant. "Careful," a guard called out in accented Hungarian, motioning for them to keep to the marked line. Even the guards seemed relaxed, confident. They weren't afraid of sabotage, they didn't expect rebellion. They simply expected the system to work. At the far end of the hall, a newly assembled aircraft sat on its wheels, still bare metal, wings stretched wide. A P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, deadly. Laszlo had heard of them on the front, how they screamed out of nowhere, how their machine guns tore convoys apart. Now here it was, not a legend, but a product rolling off a line. He walked past it slowly, every rivet catching the light. It didn't look fragile, it looked inevitable. Outside, the tour continued past other buildings, engine workshops, testing hangars, warehouses stacked to the ceiling. Rail lines ran straight into the complex, carrying parts in one direction and finished planes in the other. A guard pointed at a small sign over the tracks. In neat lettering it read, "Departure schedule every 3 hours." Every 3 hours, another shipment of death lifted into the sky. Laszlo inhaled deeply, the air filled with the scent of oil and heat. He could feel the weight of something larger than armies. This was why they were losing. The foreman stopped beside a row of crates stamped with black stencils, Allison Engine Plant, Detroit. He smiled faintly, proud. "We don't just build here," he said to the interpreter. "We build everywhere. It's like a river. Factories feed factories." Laszlo thought of Hungary, of one small plant begging another for steel, for fuel, for anything. Here, the factories fed each other like an ecosystem designed to win. Peter whispered, "How do you fight something like this?" No one answered. In one corner of the yard, a group of American women sat on a bench, eating lunch from tin boxes. They laughed together, casual, calm. Not soldiers, not frightened civilians. Workers, builders of victory. One of them noticed the group of prisoners staring. She didn't flinch, she didn't spit. She simply waved, like someone waving at a stranger from another country, not another war. Peter gave a short, stunned laugh. They wave at us. Laszlo didn't laugh. Something twisted inside him, not shame exactly, but a deep, quiet understanding. He had spent years believing war was won in trenches, in mud, in blood. But here, war was being won with factories, with organization, with hands that built instead of only destroyed. As the tour ended, the prisoners were herded back toward the trucks. But no one spoke. The noise of the factory still echoed in their heads. They climbed into the truck bed like men leaving a cathedral. On the way back to camp, Peter broke the silence first. "It's like they've already won," he said softly. "They have," another man answered. Laszlo stared at his hands. They still smelled faintly of engine grease from his old workshop back home. He thought about how much he'd once believed in the strength of German arms. He thought about the hunger in their units, the cold, the shortages. And then he thought about the clean, confident hum of that factory. The truck rolled past a stretch of farmland where tractors moved in neat rows. Even their farms looked like they were part of the machine. Not a nation scraping to survive, but one feeding itself as it fed the war. Laszlo exhaled slowly, the sound barely louder than the truck's wheels. For the first time, the idea that their side could ever win felt like a story told to children. The convoy turned toward the camp, sunlight glinting off the fence in the distance. But his mind stayed in the factory. In the sound of the machines. In the sight of wings rising from assembly lines. In the wave of a woman who built warplanes and didn't even look afraid. That was power. Not the kind that shouted. The kind that didn't have to. The return to Camp Ley was quiet. No jokes, no whispers, just the steady rattle of truck wheels against smooth American roads. The factory's noise still echoed in their heads like a distant drum that wouldn't stop. They had seen something no speech could describe. It wasn't a battlefield, it was a storm of order. When the trucks rolled through the camp gates, the sun was already dipping low. The prisoners climbed down one by one, boots crunching on gravel. The same barracks they had entered just days earlier suddenly felt smaller, like something built for a different kind of world. Laszlo walked back to his bunk in silence. Peter followed a step behind, eyes distant, jaw tight. Around them, men sat on their beds, staring at the floor, at the ceiling, at nothing. It wasn't exhaustion, it was something heavier. A silence packed with realization. Someone finally spoke, a tall corporal with sharp cheekbones named Ferenc. He had been a loyal man, the kind who had once parroted German slogans with conviction. Now his voice cracked as he muttered, "That factory, it builds more planes in a week than our entire Air Force." A few men shifted uncomfortably, as if admitting it out loud made it more real. Ferenc pressed his palms together and whispered, almost to himself, "We never stood a chance." Peter sat on the edge of his bunk, elbows on knees, staring at his hands. "They build them like we build bicycles," he said flatly. No sarcasm, just the blunt truth. Laszlo lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the beams above him. His mind replayed every step of the tour. The conveyor belts, the riveters, the faces of young women assembling wings with easy confidence. Those workers were as dangerous as any soldier on the front line. Perhaps more so. He remembered the way the foreman had spoken, not with arrogance but certainty. And the wave from that woman near the bench. That single gesture had carried more power than any rifle he had ever held. In the next bunk, an older sergeant named Karali cleared his throat. "We were told they were soft," he said, "that America was lazy, disorganized, dependent on others to fight for them." "They lied," Peter muttered. "They didn't need to," Karali corrected quietly. "We wanted to believe it." The room grew still. For years, their entire war had been built on the myth of American weakness. That the country was too far away, too spoiled, too distracted to fight. But that myth had cracked in one afternoon, under the roar of assembly lines and the gleam of polished metal. A younger soldier, barely 20, spoke from the corner. "But the Germans said." His voice faltered halfway through. He didn't finish the sentence. Ferenc gave a dry, bitter laugh. "The Germans said a lot of things." There it was, the first sound of a faith collapsing. Laszlo sat up slowly, his fingers knotting together. He thought of his first months at the front, marching under German banners, believing they were part of something mighty. Believing the Reich was unstoppable. But Germany had never shown them anything like what they'd seen today. The Reich built armies. America built empires of production. Peter exhaled sharply. "They didn't even guard us closely in the factory," he said. "Did you notice? No shouting, no dogs, just trust, like they knew we couldn't do a damn thing." Karali nodded, because they know they've already won. No one argued. The lights in the barracks flickered as night settled over the camp. Outside, a train whistle blew, steady, reliable, like everything else in this country seemed to be. Back home, trains had become unpredictable ghosts, running when fuel could be scrounged or when tracks weren't bombed out. Here they sang through the night without interruption. Laszlo lay back down, hands folded behind his head. He could almost picture the inside of the factory, even with his eyes closed, the smell of hot oil, the rhythmic stamping, the perfect synchronization. For years, he'd believed that war was fought by the brave. But now he understood, it was won by the prepared. Ferenc's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time. "What happens to men like us after a war like this?" No one had an answer. Peter tilted his head toward Laszlo. "You were a mechanic," he said softly. "What did you see?" Laszlo thought carefully before speaking. "I saw a machine," he finally said. "Not the kind you fix with a wrench, the kind you can't stop." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few heads turned toward him, eyes hollow, tired, understanding. Every one of them had come face to face with something larger than an army. The young soldier in the corner whispered, "Then why are they treating us so well?" Karali let out a bitter chuckle, "Because they can afford to." And it was true. The clean barracks, the food, the coffee, the books, the lack of fear in their guards, none of it came from kindness alone. It came from the certainty of power. Laszlo rolled onto his side, eyes half closed. He remembered how the Germans had treated their own allies with contempt, handing out scraps, keeping all power centralized. The Americans didn't need to act like tyrants. Their strength was so complete it spoke for itself. The conversation faded into a low murmur. Men spoke quietly in pairs, some in disbelief, others in grim acceptance. Not a single voice defended the old illusions anymore. Even those who had once idolized Berlin now stared at the floor. Outside, the night air was cool, and the scent of distant pine drifted through the open window. No sirens, no bombers. Just the silence. Peter lay back and whispered the thought none of them wanted to say aloud. They'll rebuild the world after this. Laszlo turned his head. Who? Them. No one argued. The quiet inside the barracks wasn't fear anymore. It was realization, the slow, heavy kind that changes everything. They had entered this war believing they were part of something powerful. Tonight they understood they had never been on the winning side. Laszlo closed his eyes, the hum of that factory still thrumming in his chest like a heartbeat. He didn't know what future awaited them after the war. But he did know one thing, they were living inside someone else's victory now. The morning began like any other. The clang of the bell, the smell of coffee drifting through the mess hall, the steady rhythm of a camp that ran like clockwork. But something in the air was different. The guards were sharper, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their boots polished until they shone like mirrors. Laszlo noticed it before anyone said a word. Today wasn't routine. After breakfast, the prisoners were ordered into formation in the yard. Not with rifles at their backs, not barked at, but efficiently, cleanly. Then came something none of them expected: chairs. Rows of folding chairs were set up under a striped canopy near the main administration building. A stage had been built overnight, complete with microphones and a lectern. The prisoners exchanged puzzled glances. Peter leaned close. What are they doing? A parade? Laszlo didn't answer. His eyes followed the convoy rolling through the camp gate. But this wasn't a military convoy. The vehicles were black sedans, with flags fluttering on the hoods. The men and women who stepped out of them didn't wear uniforms. They wore suits. Civilians. The first woman who emerged adjusted her hat and fixed her papers. The man beside her had a pin on his lapel, a small eagle. These were not soldiers, they were lawmakers. Laszlo's brow furrowed. Lawmakers here. In Europe, politicians hid behind walls or paraded in gilded halls far from the front. Here they had come to a prisoner of war camp. The prisoners watched as the visitors were greeted by officers in crisp dress uniforms. But something strange happened. The officers saluted the civilians. Peter whispered, "Did you see that?" "Yes," Laszlo said quietly, "I saw." It wasn't a formality. The gesture carried real weight. Generals bowing, if only slightly, to people who didn't wear medals. For men who had grown up in a system where power came from the top down, it was disorienting, almost absurd. Chairs were arranged for the visitors, and microphones crackled to life. Interpreters moved quietly among the prisoner rows, ready to translate. Then the session began. The woman at the center of the group stepped up to the lectern. She introduced herself through the interpreter, not as an officer, not as a minister of war. As a member of Congress. She spoke about oversight, about accountability, about making sure the army treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, about how the war didn't give anyone the right to ignore the law. Laszlo stared at her as the interpreter spoke in Hungarian. It was almost impossible to process. A civilian woman standing on a stage in front of uniformed officers, telling them how they must behave. In their world, generals didn't answer to anyone. Here they answered to her. Behind her, other lawmakers asked questions, real, pointed questions. They wanted numbers, conditions, medical reports. They demanded explanations, not deference. Ferenc muttered under his breath, "This must be theater. No army lets civilians order them around." But then something shattered that assumption. One of the officers, an older man with rows of ribbons on his chest, stood up and began to explain himself. He didn't bark, he didn't sneer. He answered clearly, calmly, like a man accountable to something larger than his own rank. Laszlo's breath caught. The image of the German generals he'd once seen, strutting, untouchable, worshipped, flashed in his mind. This scene was the opposite of everything he'd been taught. The lawmakers continued their questioning. They asked about ration allocations for POWs, about the work assignments, about literacy programs in the camp library. The officers listened and responded. It wasn't theater. It was government. A ripple of confusion ran through the prisoners. Peter leaned closer, whispering, "She's giving them orders." "She doesn't need a gun to do it," Laszlo replied softly. Then came something even more surreal. They called a few of the prisoners forward. Laszlo's heart jumped when he heard his name. He and two others, Peter and Karoli, were led toward the canopy. A guard handed them translation headsets. The woman smiled politely, "We'd like to ask a few questions," she said through the interpreter. Her tone was formal but not hostile. She asked about the food, the treatment, the medical care. She asked if they were allowed to write letters, if anyone had been mistreated, if they had access to books. Peter looked like someone trying to make sense of a dream. He answered slowly, carefully, "We are treated well, better than I expected." The lawmakers nodded, scribbling notes like it actually mattered. Then came the moment that broke every expectation Laszlo still held. The senior officer on stage didn't interrupt, he didn't glare. He just stood there, listening to prisoners speak in front of civilians who outranked him without wearing a single medal. Back in Europe, the mere idea of prisoners criticizing a camp in front of politicians was laughable. Here it was standard procedure. Karoli, the older sergeant, spoke up next. "The food is good, the beds are clean, we are not beaten." His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief at being asked. The woman nodded. "That's how it should be." Laszlo stared at her for a long moment. She wasn't commanding armies. She was commanding the rules the armies lived by. The questioning continued for nearly an hour. The lawmakers asked for documents. They inspected the kitchen, the medical wing, even the laundry. They spoke with camp staff and prisoners alike. What stunned Laszlo most wasn't what they did. It was how calmly the officers accepted it. There was no shouting, no chest beating, no theater of power. Because here, power wasn't a performance. It was a structure. When the session ended, the prisoners were escorted back to their places. The lawmakers shook hands with officers, not as subordinates, but as equals bound by rules. Peter sat on the barrack steps, staring at the sky. "They let civilians question their generals," he said quietly, as if repeating it would make it less impossible. Ferenc shook his head slowly. "If a civilian tried that in Berlin, they'd disappear by morning." "They don't have to disappear anyone here," Karoli murmured. "Their power is already settled." Laszlo lowered himself beside Peter, elbows resting on his knees. This morning had been louder than the factory. Not in sound, but in meaning. The factory had shown them how America could win a war. Today had shown them why it might win every war that followed. He tried to picture Hitler answering questions from a baker or a schoolteacher. The thought was absurd. And yet here, a woman in a neat hat had made officers stand straight and explain themselves. It wasn't just machines and oil fueling this country. It was an idea. One that ran deeper than uniforms and deeper than fear. Ferenc exhaled hard through his nose. "I don't understand this place." "You don't have to," Peter said softly. "They do." For the rest of the day, the camp buzzed with quiet conversations. The men had no common language for what they had seen. The idea that soldiers could obey civilians wasn't just foreign, it was almost insulting to everything they had been raised to believe. But beneath that disbelief, something else grew. Respect, uneasy, reluctant, but real. As evening fell, Laszlo sat by the barracks window, watching the lights of the guard towers glow against the dark. The lawmakers were long gone, their sedans swallowed by the night. But their presence lingered like the echo of a different kind of power. Peter lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. "They don't need fear to keep control," he whispered. Laszlo nodded slowly. "No, they use rules." It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud. But it was unshakable. Outside, a train passed through the distance, its whistle cutting through the night with its steady, confident note. And for the first time, the prisoners began to understand something dangerous and simple. They weren't just captives of a stronger army. They were inside a country built to outlast empires. The morning whistle cut through the cool Virginia air. Laszlo swung his legs out of the bunk, his body already adapting to the rhythm of Camp Lee. Coffee, roll call, trucks, orders. It wasn't a military bark, but a steady pulse. The same pulse he had first felt in the harbor, then in the factory, and now, day by day, in the rhythm of captivity. That day, their work detail was different. Instead of returning to the aircraft plant, their group was split into smaller teams and handed over to local civilian contractors. The guards called it a labor program. To the prisoners, it was another step deeper into a system that never seemed to falter. As the trucks rolled out of the camp gates, the sun was climbing over the tree line, washing the landscape in pale gold. The convoy split at a crossroads, some trucks toward rail yards, others toward farms. Laszlo, Peter, and Karoli found themselves heading toward a sawmill. The mill was nestled beside a wide river. Smoke rose from its tall chimney in a steady, even column. No bombers, no shelling, no trenches. Just the clean hum of saw blades slicing through American pine. A foreman greeted them with a clipboard in hand. He wore a work jacket and a cap, not a uniform. He didn't look at them like enemies, he looked at them like laborers. And that somehow felt stranger. The prisoners were handed gloves and assigned tasks, stacking timber, feeding logs onto conveyors, hauling finished planks into neat stacks. Guards watched from a distance, rifles slung loosely at their sides, as if they knew nothing dramatic would happen. Within an hour, the rhythm of the mill wrapped itself around Laszlo. The blades sang a clean, relentless song. Logs entered at one end of the building, were split, planed, stacked, and loaded at the other. Every man knew his role, every machine worked. It was industry without desperation. Peter wiped his brow, leaving a streak of sawdust across his forehead. "They don't waste anything," he muttered, "not even wood." Laszlo nodded. He noticed how the workers swept sawdust into bins to be used for packing material. Offcuts were sorted, not thrown away. Even the waste served a purpose. The prisoners worked alongside civilians, young men too young for the front, older men too old, and a handful of women tying stacks of timber with practiced hands. No one shouted at them. No one spat. They worked together like gears in the same quiet machine. During the midday break, the foreman handed out sandwiches and water. He spoke to them through a translator, explaining how the timber would be used. "Barracks training facilities, hospitals, bridges, you build here," he said, tapping the timber with his pencil, "and somewhere out there something stands." Laszlo chewed slowly, his stomach tightening. You build here and somewhere out there something stands. Even their labor, the labor of enemies, was being woven into the American war effort. Karoli gave a low, humorless chuckle. "We're helping them win." "They don't need help," Peter replied. "They're just faster." Laszlo wiped his hands on his trousers. "They're not faster," he said quietly. "They're prepared." That distinction mattered. The Germans had always boasted about speed, lightning war, quick strikes. The Americans didn't boast, they built. And they built as if they'd known the war would come long before it began. After the break, the work resumed. A light breeze carried the smell of sawdust and clean water from the river. Laszlo found himself settling into the rhythm, his body remembering the muscle memory of pre-war work. This wasn't the grinding desperation of the front. This was a function. Late in the afternoon, the foreman walked the line, inspecting stacks. He stopped in front of Laszlo's team, nodded approvingly, and said something to the interpreter. "Good work," the interpreter translated. "The shipment goes out tonight." The words shouldn't have mattered. But they did. Back at the camp that evening, the mood in the barracks was different than after the factory tour or the lawmaker's visit. It wasn't shock, it was something quieter. They had touched the gears of the machine now, not just observed them. Ferenc, the former corporal who'd once mocked everything American, sat on his bunk with sawdust still in his hair. "They use us like parts," he said softly, "and we fit." Peter threw his work gloves onto the floor. "We fit because they've made a place for everything." "And everyone," Karoli added. The conversation spread through the room. The men compared their work details. Some had helped repair rail lines, some had harvested crops, others had worked in packing warehouses. Each story carried the same quiet thread. No chaos, no shouting, just order. Ferenc leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. In Germany, prisoners build because they're forced, he said. Here, they make us build because it's easier than not. Laszlo lay on his bunk, hands folded behind his head. He could still feel the weight of the timber on his shoulders. In Budapest, sawmills had been quiet for months. No fuel, no men, no time. Here, the war wasn't choking life. It was feeding on life that never stopped. Karoli broke the silence. We're fighting an enemy that doesn't need to conquer us to use us. The words settled like dust. Peter exhaled. They don't need to break us, just put us to work. That night, Laszlo couldn't sleep right away. The rhythm of the sawmill stayed with him, the clean, efficient bite of the blades, the way the timber fell into perfect stacks. No slogans, no shouting, no violence. Just the endless, quiet certainty of production. He thought of the propaganda posters he'd seen back home. Images of glorious battles, roaring tanks, invincible armies. None of them had prepared him for this kind of war, the kind fought with hammers, trains, factories, and sawmills. The kind that didn't end when the shooting did. Somewhere beyond the camp fence, another train whistle cut through the night. He could almost imagine the timber they'd cut sliding onto a flatbed car, rolling towards some distant front where American soldiers would build another bridge, another base, another piece of the empire rising one plank at a time. Peter shifted on the bunk below him. They don't even hate us, he whispered. No, Laszlo said, we're just part of the work. For a long time, neither of them spoke again. The barracks creaked softly as men drifted into uneasy sleep. They were enemies, yes, but also hands in someone else's machine. And the machine didn't care where the hands came from. It only cared that they moved in rhythm. Summer came to Virginia like a slow, warm tide. The pine trees deepened in color, the air grew heavier, and the days lengthened into golden evenings. For the prisoners of Camp Lee, time no longer felt like a countdown to something. It was a rhythm, steady, predictable, relentless. Laszlo woke at dawn to the same whistle, drank the same coffee, rode the same truck to work. He could trace the camp's schedule down to the minute, without a clock. It should have been suffocating. Instead, it was almost calming. Each day blurred into the next. Sawmills, fields, warehouses, small construction sites. They built and moved and stacked without resistance. And the machine around them, the American machine, never faltered. In Europe, time had felt like a collapse. Bridges blown up, factories abandoned, whole towns gone in a week. Here, time didn't collapse, it stretched. Peter often joked at the end of each day, they'll keep doing this until the sun burns out. The strange thing was, it didn't feel like a joke. Even the guards changed in subtle ways. They were no longer on edge. They smiled sometimes, spoke to the prisoners about baseball scores or radio music. Some of them shared cigarettes. They weren't comrades, but they weren't monsters either. It unsettled some of the men. For Ferenc, once a proud corporal, it was unbearable. They act like we're not even enemies, he muttered one evening, pacing the barracks like a trapped wolf. They should hate us. Karoli, sitting on the bunk with a book in his hands, a book from the camp library in German, looked up calmly. They don't need to hate us, they've already beaten us. Ferenc scowled, we're still soldiers. No, Peter said softly from the corner, we're workers now, that's worse. A silence spread through the room. It wasn't bitter, just true. They were no longer part of a war, they were inside its aftermath, even though the war itself still raged somewhere across the ocean. Letters arrived at the camp once a month. Some prisoners received thin envelopes from Hungary, heavy with news written between lines of censorship. Others received nothing at all. The Americans let them read in silence, never pressing, never mocking. They didn't have to. One evening, after work at the sawmill, Laszlo sat on the steps outside the barracks watching the sun sink behind the trees. The horizon seemed endless here. not fractured by ruins, not cut by front lines. Peter joined him with a cup of water, lowering himself onto the step with a groan. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "that this place is going to outlive everything we know?" Laszlo didn't answer at first. He watched the guard tower silhouetted against the sunset. The searchlight didn't even rotate anymore. It didn't need to. "Yes," he finally said, "I think it already has." Peter nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the rim of his cup. "They don't feel the war the way we do. They don't have to." And that was the truth that hung heavier with each passing week. For the Americans, the war was a project, enormous, brutal, but distant. For the prisoners, it had been a fire eating everything they loved. The difference was a chasm no bridge could span. Laszlo had started spending more time in the camp library. It had felt absurd at first, a library for prisoners. But the shelves were full, English, German, French, even Hungarian titles. He wasn't reading to escape, he was trying to understand. The books on American history were written with the same calm certainty as their factories ran. A country that had never seen foreign armies burn its cities. A country that fought its wars far away. A country that built more every year, even when the world tore itself apart. One night, Carolee closed his book with a soft thud. "They built this place to last," he said. "All of it, the roads, the factories, the farms, even the way they talk." Ferenc snorted, "Talk doesn't win wars." "No," Carolee said quietly, "but it survives them." The sentence lingered in the air long after the lights dimmed. Outside, another train passed in the night, its whistle long and low. Laszlo had begun to map the passing of time through those trains. Every night, without fail, one would come. They carried timber, food, engines, iron, tanks, and men. The war might rage on in Europe, but here it was simply scheduled. In August, the first newspaper clippings appeared in the canteen. Allied advances, German retreats, names of towns most of them had marched through on their way to defeat. Laszlo read the headlines slowly, tracing the collapse of the world he had once known. But what struck him most wasn't the news. It was how quietly the Americans received it. Victory wasn't something they were waiting for with clenched fists. It was something they were preparing for like a train schedule, fixed, inevitable. Peter tapped one of the clippings. "Berlin will fall." "Yes," Laszlo said, "and they'll just keep building." As the heat of summer settled over Virginia, the camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a map of the future. Not their future, but someone's. Laszlo lay awake late into the night, listening to the wind move through the pines. He thought about Budapest, about the ruined workshops, the faces of friends who'd vanished in the snow, about the flag he'd once believed in. All of it felt smaller now, like a story from another lifetime. America wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. But it was endless. And that kind of power was more terrifying than any army. Peter rolled over in the bunk below. "They're going to win," he murmured, not asking. "Yes," Laszlo said in the dark, "and they won a long time ago." The camp bell rang the next morning like it always did. The trucks rolled like they always had. And the horizon stayed exactly where it was, long, patient, waiting. The autumn wind rolled through Virginia like a quiet tide. The pine trees shed their needles slowly, carpeting the ground in fading green. Camp Lee had changed in small, nearly invisible ways. Fewer guards at the gate. More newspapers on the bulletin boards. And a new sound that none of the prisoners could ignore, cheering from the radios in the canteen. It started with whispers. Whispers that turned to headlines. Paris liberated. German retreat. The Reich cracking open. For months, the prisoners had felt the war at a distance. They'd seen no battlefields, no burned-out cities. But now the end of it crept through the camp like a cold wind. Even here in the quiet heart of America, history was shifting. Laszlo stood by the fence one morning, his fingers resting on the cold wire. Beyond it, a convoy rolled down the road, a stream of trucks and men headed toward somewhere else. Training, replacement, supply. The machine kept moving. Peter joined him, hands in his pockets. They cheer like it's already over, he said softly. It is, Laszlo replied. For us, it ended the day we saw the harbor. Peter gave a dry laugh. You're not wrong. Over the months, the men had stopped talking about going home. Not because they didn't want to, but because the world they'd left behind was dissolving. Each headline on the wall chipped away at what remained of it. Berlin was being squeezed from both sides. Factories gone, railways cut. The Reich was a hollow shell, and they all knew it. Ferenc, once loud and defiant, now spent most of his evenings silent at the edge of the barracks. His faith in the war had died without a funeral. Caroly read newspapers line by line, like someone dissecting a patient already dead. When the news came of the Ardennes push, Germany's last desperate gasp, no one in the camp doubted how it would end. The Americans didn't celebrate wildly. They just kept working. Trains kept rolling. Factories kept roaring. A war machine that didn't depend on a single victory, just the next shipment. Winter came with crisp air and the scent of wood smoke. The prisoners received new coats, more blankets. Small kindnesses that still unsettled them. Back in Europe, soldiers froze in trenches while their captors handed them wool and boots. One night, as snow dusted the ground, the guards turned up the radio in the canteen. The voice of a newsreader filled the room. The German army is collapsing on all fronts. American forces are advancing toward the Rhine. No cheers this time, just a quiet, collective exhale. The thing everyone had known but not spoken was now simply official. Peter leaned against the wall. It's over. Caroly folded his arms. Not yet. But close enough, Peter said. Laszlo stood near the stove, the heat washing over his face. He thought of the factory, the lawmakers, the sawmill, the endless roads and trains. It had all been pointing toward this moment. The outcome was not sudden, it was designed. Back home, everything had been about willpower, about fighting harder, shouting louder, praying the gods of war would pick their side. Here it had always been about certainty. The next weeks passed like the long, slow turn of a clock hand. Work details continued, guards rotated, supplies flowed. But something had shifted in the way the Americans looked at them. Not pity, not cruelty. Just a kind of distant finality. The prisoners felt it too. Every night, as the train whistles echoed through the cold air, they knew those trains weren't headed toward desperate front lines anymore. They were headed toward victory. Then one morning, the announcement came. A guard read it aloud at roll call in measured tones. The German government has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. For a moment, the yard was silent. No cheering. No weeping. Just wind moving through the pines. Peter stared down at the ground. That's it. Laszlo's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, but nothing felt right. Because for them, the war had already ended months ago, not with a surrender, but with understanding. Ferenc sat down on the gravel, hands over his face. The man who had once spat at the idea of American strength now trembled quietly. It's gone, he whispered, all of it. Caroly nodded. It was gone long before Berlin. That afternoon, the guards allowed them into the canteen to listen to President Truman's address. The voice on the radio was calm, steady, utterly unlike the speeches they'd grown up with. No shouting, no triumphal roar. Just a simple promise, to rebuild, to bring the troops home, to move forward. Peter leaned close, listened to him. He doesn't sound like a conqueror. Laszlo closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. No, he whispered, he sounds like someone who never doubted. The prisoners returned to their barracks in silence. Some stared out of the windows for hours, watching the long shadows stretch across the camp yard. For the first time in years, there was no war ahead. Only what came after. Ferenc finally spoke that night, his voice low. They'll rebuild everything. Karali, sitting on his bunk, shook his head slowly. No, they won't rebuild everything. They'll build something new. Laszlo lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. The smell of pine and machine oil still hung in the air. This camp had been his prison, but also a window. He had seen an empire without a crown. A country that won without shouting. Tomorrow or the next week or the next month the trucks would come. Some of them would be shipped home, some would be sent elsewhere. The war was over, but its imprint would follow them forever. Peter's voice floated up from the bunk below. When you get home, what will you tell them? Laszlo thought for a long time before answering. The truth, he said, that they were never fighting boys, they were fighting a world. The pines rustled in the wind, the night cool and clean. Somewhere in the distance, another train blew its whistle, no longer heading toward war, but toward whatever came next. Laszlo closed his eyes. The guns had gone quiet, but the machine was still running.